This story may not seem too scary to some people, but if it wasn't for my quick thinking and pure dumb luck, this story could have ended quite differently. For context, I'm female, and at the time of this story, I was around 14 years old or so. At this time, I lived in apartments just a bit of walking distance away from the middle school with my mother. There were two ways to get to and from my school. There was the shortcut, which ran through a little path in the woods behind the school and took me straight to the apartments through a hole in the fence. Then there was the long way, in which I had to walk down the main road, past the breakfast restaurant next door to my school, a few other buildings too, for about 2 blocks, then turn down a side street and walk for another 2 minutes to the apartments at the dead end. My mom would walk with me most mornings to go to school, but I would almost always walk home alone. Walking home, I would always take the long way around, simply because the grass in the forest was extremely overgrown, and I wasn't a huge fan of bugs, or really anything that could possibly crawl up my legs and onto my arms. Plus, I never really minded the short 5-minute walk home. One day, as I was about to start my walk home after school though, I didn't even make it to the street before I felt something off. I suddenly felt like something wasn't right, and for the life of me, I could not figure out what it was. Therefore, I slowed my walking pace and started to take a glance around me. It only took around 30 seconds for me to figure out just why I was feeling off. Slightly off to the side, not directly in line with the other vehicles and parents waiting to pick up their children, was a pure black Escalade with severely tinted windows. In the driver's seat, with the window rolled all the way down, sat a large black man with dark sunglasses, staring in my direction. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew that he was staring directly at me. I want to point out that at this point in time, I didn't have a cell phone yet, so there was no way for me to call anyone. Looking back, I guess I could have gone back into the school and found an adult, but I wasn't really thinking about that. I tried to calm down by telling myself I was just being paranoid, and there was no way in hell he was there for me. There was no way he was just waiting there and staring and watching me in particular. Then, I thought about the fact that I had to cross right in front of his vehicle in order to even leave the school campus and start my walk down the main road. The closer and closer I got to the crossing, I could see out of the corner of my eye that his head moved ever so slightly where I walked. So much for me just being paranoid. I should add that all of this happened within the span of about a minute, and where I was about to cross was only 10 feet in front of his vehicle. I went through what I could possibly do if he tried to follow me. I decided against taking the shortcut because I wanted to make sure I stayed where people could see me. What worried me the most was the semi-long side street I had to go down to get home. Before I could think of a clear plan though, suddenly I saw a woman from my church and her husband leaving the restaurant across from my school. Without any hesitation and without even thinking really, I ran right over to them yelling, "Hey, did my mom get y'all to come pick me up?" Before she could answer, I had already hopped in the back seat of their car. Confused and with a light laugh, she said, "No, but we can drop you off if you'd like." I sat in her back seat extremely relieved but forced myself to glance back towards that black Escalade. I noticed that it had since pulled off and raced down the street in the opposite direction of my home. The woman from my church made sure I got home safely, although I never did tell her of my fears. I never really mentioned this to anyone, especially not my mother, until I was well into adulthood. I liked the little bit of freedom I had, being able to walk back and forth to school by myself. I never saw that Escalade again and made a mental note to change how I got back and forth to school. Some days I would take the long way, other days the shortcut, or even the bus. I was overly paranoid even though nothing actually happened to me. It's unknown what could have happened had the scene played out differently, and I didn't run into someone that was able to get me home safely. To this day, I am so grateful for her and her husband, and they have no idea even that they may have very well saved my life that day. So, a few days ago, I got back from a family holiday in the countryside on a really nice property. I'm not sure if it was through Airbnb or some other similar company, but imagine that kind of thing. A fully furnished house with more or less all amenities provided. I have a fairly wide, extended family, some of whom would be staying with us, some of whom wouldn't be, and some of whom would only be staying for a few nights before leaving early. My parents and I would be staying all week though, and we were the very first to arrive at the house. As I said before, it was a very good-looking property, not surrounded by other houses, but not completely isolated either. Because we were the first to arrive, we basically got first picks on rooms, and were able to unpack and explore the whole place before everyone else even arrived. I got my own room on the first floor. For reference, I'm 18 years old. There's one room on the top floor with a bathroom attached. Going up there, the first thing that struck me was just how hot it was in there. There were windows through which the sun was shining in, which I thought might be the source of this heat, so I shut all the blinds, but it didn't really get any cooler. Aside from the bathroom, there was another door in this room, but it was locked from the other side. It goes without saying that this was kind of weird, not the least because I had no idea what could possibly be on the other side of that door. There was a locked door downstairs too, but that one had an obvious keyhole and was very clearly a boiler room due to the sounds I could hear on the other side. But with this room, I just really had no idea what it could possibly be. There was also a small crawlspace door upstairs. It didn't have a lock or handle or anything like that, but I couldn't figure out how to open it. I'm not sure how relevant that crawlspace really was to all of this, but I thought I'd at least mention it as somewhat suspicious. Anyway, after a few hours, other family members arrived, including my grandparents who, being the oldest in the family, and so the most respected, got to choose a room as well and chose upstairs. Despite the fact that my grandparents are both in their 70s, they're both extremely fit, not just for their age, but for anybody really. They keep very active, and they don't get scared very easily at all. I couldn't say I really envied them taking that top room though. I'll skip most of the other details about the holiday since they aren't really relevant to the story itself, and fast forward to the first night. The property had this large garden, like really big. People at one end would have to scream for someone at the other end to even hear them. What made the property even nicer to me was there was a large hot tub out back by that garden. On the first evening, 11 p.m., I was in the hot tub by myself. Most of the other people had already gone to sleep. Having all the lights out and just sitting in the bubbling water, the only sounds audible to me were the buzzing of the jets and the chirping of the crickets. It was quite the serene experience. Just barely over the sound of the water though, I could have sworn I heard something moving down on the other end of the garden. There was no way I could be sure of that though since it was so far away. I turned on the lights in the tub to as high as they could go, but obviously that didn't provide me with very much in the way of visibility. Looking back, it was actually probably a pretty stupid move because it made me more visible. I still couldn't see to the end of the garden, but now I kinda had the creeps. I realized just how exposed I felt, and decided to wrap up and head to bed. My room had these big glass doors that faced out into the back garden, which also made me kind of uneasy. I'd be lying though if I told you I heard any scratches on my window or something cliche like that. I actually didn't hear anything else and went to sleep perfectly fine. The next morning at breakfast though, I was talking with my grandma, who sorta dropped a bombshell on me. She told me that last night she had noticed a light turn on then off in the locked room upstairs. Not that I said anything, but this really freaked me out. I know the idea of someone secretly living in the house with us sounds dumb, and that's not really where my mind was going. Truth be told, I wasn't sure what to think. So that night I got totally drunk, like really hammered. I'm a bit of a lightweight and obviously not an experienced drinker, so it really didn't take much for me to get to that point. Regardless, I'm not exactly proud of the state I was in. I went out to the hot tub again, this time with my cousin who was a bit older than me, not even aware of my surroundings. The heat of the water combined with the effects of the alcohol made my brain basically turn into mush. I couldn't think clearly, and that's by my own admission. We were just listening to music and sort of chilling, when she suddenly pointed over at the other end of the garden to get my attention. "Hey, do you see that?" she asked. The garden had these automatic lights along one side, so if there was any movement they would turn on, illuminating one half of the lawn. From what I had seen, 2 of them, they weren't super sensitive, so you would have to get really close. I peered over the side of the tub but couldn't see anything in the dark. That's when my cousin had the bright idea to reach over the side and throw a football onto the garden. The sound it made as it thudded onto the grass still makes me feel sick. The lights flashed on, revealing a dark figure scurrying behind the fence at the back of the yard and just out of sight. We should have probably gotten out of the tub and went to bed at that point, or in reality called the cops, but for some dumb reason, we decided to go and investigate ourselves. She was a few drinks in too, I'll note. Not as much as me, and she keeps it down much better, but we both had some liquid courage going, if you know what I mean. Once we got there, it was too dark to see much, but the fence was very clearly broken to the point where someone could easily squeeze through the gap in it and make their way onto the road adjacent to the property. That alone is creepy enough, but what really freaks me out is what happened the next day. For a little bit of context, I'm in the build-up to some really important exams right now, and just because I was on holiday didn't mean I would be cutting myself any slack in studying. Because of this, when my whole family went out that day, I stayed home to work. In my room, there was this rubber door stopper thing propping my door open, and a spare one in the drawers as well. I left the one propping the door open next to it, in case I wanted to keep the door open or more realistically keep it shut. Bear in mind that particular door did not have a lock on it. I kept the second one hidden under my bed in a really specific place you would never find unless you were deliberately looking for it, tucked away in the bed frame basically. The door doesn't close by itself, but if there's a draft, it will eventually slam shut after some time. At some point, I got very bored of studying and decided to go make myself a drink and get some snacks. What can you do? While in the kitchen, though, I heard this loud thud come from my room. Because of the way the kitchen was positioned, I couldn't actually see my door, though. At first, this understandably freaked me out, but then I heard the front door open. It was just my family. I put it out of my mind and returned to my room, only to see that the rubber door stopper was balanced on the door frame, just flush against the wall. I assumed it must have been someone in my family. I walked back in, only to see that the other stopper was still next to the door. I questioned my family at dinner. They all swore up and down they hadn't moved a single thing. This created some quite nasty implications, mainly that I had been home alone with someone, or perhaps something. I'm not sure which is scarier really. Luckily, nothing else of this nature happened during my trip, and needless to say, I was grateful just to get home. This remains the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. I haven't told my cousin about the incident, since I figure I'd probably just sound crazy. I can only speculate too as to whether or not this was related to the incident from the night before. I'd like to think they're not, but I'm fairly certain about what I saw. My only advice to anyone using Airbnb or similar services is to thoroughly research the area you'll be staying in and make absolutely sure the property is secure. This is a real story, but some of you might probably not believe me. I usually don't even talk about this because of the trauma and the fact that people look at me like I'm crazy when I tell them about it. This was on the news too, but out of privacy and respect, I won't share the articles or the news clips here. Anyways, this story is about my intuition and my friend's at times strange older brother. I'll call him Corey and I'll call her Kara. I always used to play over at her house all the time, considering her mom and my mom were the best of friends. Back then, the whole neighborhood was basically a playground, and it honestly felt so much bigger as a child. The world can be a scary place, but I always had common sense, and that kept me in one piece, considering I was very accident-prone. Anyways, I'd play a lot at Kara's house, but I always had the weirdest feeling around her brother Corey. It felt like he was constantly watching me, and it made me very uncomfortable. He seemed to be popular and everyone always hung out around him, but every time I was around him, I just felt very sick. He would do these things like kick small animals and make them yelp. He was very aggressive when he played with us too. One time he held my head underwater when we went swimming, and another time he watched me change in the bathroom. I noticed him after I got dressed and saw the door cracked open. I didn't see him, but I felt his presence there. Sometimes it even felt like his own mom was scared of him. One day I went over to Kara's house when I was in middle school. The door was unlocked, so I just walked right in. I thought they were home because I smelled spaghetti cooking, and I loved Kara's mom's cooking. I turned around. There was Corey acting just like normal. Nothing rang a bell at first. I asked him where Kara and her mom were. He said they had just gone to the store. He said I could go into Kara's room and wait for her to get back. I almost did, but I felt him looming behind me as I was about to go into her room. This was normal, just like every other time, but for some reason I got terrified out of nowhere. It felt like I was suffocating, and my throat started to hurt, and tears started to form in my eyes. I turned around and looked at him, and all of a sudden I just started begging him to let me go with tears pouring from my eyes. We stood there for 5 minutes in suffocating silence, and then he just said I could go. I faced him as I slowly backed up toward the door and ran all the way back home. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he had already killed himself. Kara was found dead in her bed, and her mom was found dead in hers as well. He had stabbed them both to death. To this day, I still don't know why he let me go and didn't kill me too. So growing up, I loved to explore abandoned places, which led to me driving a lot at night because I loved the thrill of it. Those stories are for another day though. This story is one of those night drives. This happened about 15 years ago, so some of the details might be a little hazy or different than what actually happened, but I'll try my best to recall it as accurately as I can. My friends and I decided we would take a weekend trip to the ocean. We were all prepared for the trip and ready to leave when I suddenly got a call from work. Trying to be a responsible young adult, after much frustration and moaning, I obliged to go into work. I told my friends to just leave without me. I would leave after work and meet up with them there that night. When work finally ended, the sun was already starting to set. I knew it would be a night drive, as the ocean was a 3-hour drive away. I hopped into my car and began the drive to meet up with my friends. As I didn't have a GPS in my '06 Honda, I looked up the fastest route there before I began my journey. I found out that if I took this 2-road highway, it would cut 30 minutes off of my trip, so I made the decision to take this route. An hour into my drive, there were more and more trees and less cars. At this point, it was very dark, and any light poles were far and few between. The headlights were my only source of light at this point. My eyes had just begun to adjust to the darkness when I saw a figure off to the side of the road with their thumb out. Me, thinking that people aren't always bad and always willing to help, decided to slow down to see if there was anything I could do. I was always taught as a child to help whoever I can, so it wasn't anything that I thought long and hard about. As my car came to a complete stop, I could tell the person was a middle-aged woman. I cracked my passenger side window and asked if she needed any help. She came closer to the car and looked me up and down. Then she said, "Hey, would you give me a ride over to the next town?" At this point, there were no red flags yet. I didn't really think her request was that weird, so I agreed to give her a ride. I was an average-sized 18-year-old, and she was very small in stature, so I knew if anything happened, I could take her. I unlocked the door for her and she hopped right in. As soon as she sat down, she began to profusely thank me. Looking into her eyes, I could see she had clearly been crying. She introduced herself as Molly and said, "Just to the next town, please." Then she started staring out the window. I started driving and began to ask her some questions, just so the car ride wouldn't be awkward silence, you know. I already knew the next town was near the ocean anyway, which was my destination. It would be another hour or so before we would reach it, so it would be really weird to just sit there in silence. When I asked her what she was doing here in the middle of nowhere on a highway, she said her and her boyfriend had gotten into a big fight on their way to the ocean, and he had kicked her out of the car. Somehow in my young mind, I still didn't see the danger in this. I began to console her and tell her how sorry I was, when she quickly turned to me and yelled, "Hey, slow down!" My instincts kicked in and I slammed on the brakes, thinking maybe there was something in the middle of the road I hadn't seen. What's wrong? Molly says, "Oh, I thought you missed the turn." Now, this small highway had cross streets about every half mile. "I thought you said you were going to the next town, to the ocean." She gave me the creepiest smile and said, "Oh no, I live out here. I don't really feel like going to the ocean anymore." Red flags started to go off in my head. I gave her a weird look. "Are you telling me you live out in the middle of those woods?" Sweat started to run down the side of her face. "Yeah, sorry." We continued on our drive, only now I was a little bit nervous about this stranger I had randomly picked up. She turned to look out the window again, and this time she wouldn't say a single word to me. Clearly something was very off. I kept her in my peripherals. Finally, after what seemed to be an hour but was only actually a couple of minutes, she says, "Slow down, the turn is coming up." But this time, she didn't even turn to look at me as she said it. As the car began to slow down at the crossroad, I saw two shadows duck quickly behind a tree. Being somewhat afraid now of what might happen if I took that turn, instead I slammed on the gas and drove right past. Molly began to scream at me to stop and go back. At this point, my adrenaline was quite high. I knew had I turned where she asked me to, something horrible was going to happen to me. About 10 minutes down the road, I finally stopped the car and yelled at Molly, "Get the fuck out of my car!" I grabbed the BB gun I had on the side of my door and pointed it at her. "Get the fuck out of my car or I will shoot you!" She frantically opened the door and fell out. She started running back the way we came. I sat there with my passenger side door open, still pointing the gun at nothing but trees, as I watched her disappear into the darkness. After a few moments, when I'd finally calmed down, I reached over to my passenger seat to close the passenger door, only to see a knife on the pavement where she'd fallen out of the car. I quickly closed that door and sped to the ocean where my friends were waiting. That was the very last time I ever picked up a hitchhiker. A few years ago, I worked as a janitor for a cleaning company. We cleaned all sorts of places: churches, schools, doctors' offices, you name it. The job was mostly night shift and sometimes took us to some of the more sketchy areas that were around. We had one job we went to twice a week. It was this small dentist's office, located in an office park surrounded completely by woods, on the section of road where the main, more urban road started to change into a desolate country one. When I say this office was small, I mean it was really, really small. This is an important detail to remember for the story later, as it is relevant. The office consisted of a tiny lobby when you first walked in. Then behind a window in the lobby was a little reception area, where there were various file cabinets and 2 workstations. Beyond that, straight through there was a narrow hallway with little rooms where the dentists would do their various cleanings and procedures on patients. At the far end of the hall, there was a door that led to a basement, and a slightly larger room on the right that contained 2 or 3 dentist chairs. The kind where you sit on it and it reclines so the dentist can see into your mouth. That was the layout of the entire office. Like I said, the place wasn't very big. The first incident was when I was with my work partner Matt. I was the one the boss had left in charge, and therefore it was my responsibility to walk the halls and inspect everything before we left the job site, to make sure everything was done properly. It was also my responsibility to set the security codes to each building before we went out. So while I did this, I sent Matt outside to the dumpster with a bag of garbage, which we had accumulated from the office. The dumpster was on the far end of the parking lot up against the woods. While I was inspecting the rooms to make sure nothing had been missed by either of us, I spotted some dirt on the floor, so I plugged the vacuum back in and began to suck up the dirt. Since we were packing up the work truck with all our supplies and it was a warmer night out, I left the office door open while Matt was going to the dumpster. This would make it easier to take our supplies out from the office. As I was vacuuming, I realized Matt was taking an exceptionally long time to come back from the dumpster. He wasn't normally the type to mess around and cause delay either. I turned the vacuum off and poked my head out the front door, only to see Matt sprinting away from the direction of the dumpster, his face contorted with fear. "Hey man, what the hell's wrong?" He started pointing and turned, panicking and gasping for breath as he tried to explain what he'd just seen. "Didn't you just hear me scream?" I told him no, as I'd been vacuuming and had just turned it off to see where he'd been. He told me that when he went to put the garbage in the dumpster, some guy was crouched in the dark muttering gibberish to himself. When Matt saw him, the guy got up and screamed and started sprinting at him. He told me he drew his pocket knife to try and scare the guy off and possibly defend himself if needed. Fortunately, it worked. The guy turned around and sprinted off into the woods, but he wasn't sure if he was still in the area. He wanted to leave for the next job site immediately. I will say that what I did next was neither smart nor very nice to Matt. See, I was quite troubled at this point in my life, to the point where I didn't really care what happened to me. I was also a bit cocky as I had done martial arts for 4 years and took it quite seriously, often boxing against people way bigger and stronger than me. So in my own mind, I was pretty tough. I was also a bit of a kiss-ass towards my job as I liked it perhaps a bit too much back then. I noticed Matt hadn't actually put the garbage in the dumpster, and I told him we'd have to go back to put it in, since we couldn't very well just leave it in the parking lot. He asked me if we couldn't just put it in the back of my car and drive it to the next job and dispose of it there. I told him no, as I didn't want it stinking up my car, and besides, where's the fun in that? Yeah, I was kind of a bit of a prick and a bit crazy. The look on Matt's face suggested he thought the very same thing. I laughed it off and told him I'd go with him, but first I had to get something out of my car. I went and grabbed this big heavy metal flashlight I had. It was super bright, so not only could it be used to see, but it could also be used to blind someone, and perhaps as a weapon if need be. I locked the door to the car and took the lead with my flashlight, while Matt carried the garbage bag and his pocket knife. I shined my light first at the trees near the dumpster. I didn't see anything, so I shined it at the dumpster itself. Still nothing, so I called out, "Hey, who's back there? Come out right now, you piece of shit," trying to sound tough. Truthfully, I was just looking to be a bit of a fake badass. I knew that whoever that person had been, they had probably run far off into the woods, never to be seen by either of us again. When we got to the dumpster, I walked around a 10-foot distance from its right side and shined my flashlight behind it. There was no crazy man there. I told Matt, who was hanging about 20 feet back now, that it was safe for him to put the garbage in. He did, and then we went back to the car and moved on to the next job. The second incident occurred at the same place about a year later. I was working with this new guy named Andrew, and we were cleaning up just like at that time with Matt. We had all our supplies at the front of the building by the door, and I was getting ready to set the codes for the night. We had been through the whole building, both of us, and seen every room, desk, and chair. We were the only ones in there for sure. That's when I heard a faint whispering begin coming from the other end of the hall that I mentioned earlier, the one by the basement door which we weren't allowed to go down. We never even checked down there since it wasn't part of our job. We didn't even know what was down there, but we had been in this office together for at least an hour, and we hadn't heard or seen anyone. It was well after closing time. The whispering sounded like two women. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but when I looked over at Andrew, he looked back at me with his eyes wide open. He said to me quietly, "What the fuck is that?" I asked him if he was hearing what I was hearing, just to confirm. He said yes. We both stood staring down that hall. The whispering stopped for a second, then started up again and started to get closer. We both turned to look at each other. Fuck that, man, we're not getting paid enough for this. Let's go. I set the alarm codes and we walked out and locked the door. I was now a bit smarter and less macho than the last time. To this day, I still don't know what all of that was about. Sometimes I guess buildings make noises, the wind settling or whatever, but to have two people hear the same thing at the same time, combined with that crazy guy incident from a year prior, just seems weird. I know that some of these medical type buildings have different drugs stored in them, and sometimes people did break into them to steal the drugs, so maybe it was that, but I don't really know. Anyways, I don't work there anymore, and I haven't for a long time, which I'm glad about that. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, comment, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any comments or criticism about the video or the stories therein, please be sure to go down to the comments below and leave your thoughts. I always love to read all of the comments, and even though I can't respond to all of them, I still do look at each and every one. I would like to thank for this video my subscribers who submitted their own stories to be read and shared. I hope you guys enjoyed them, and I hope those of you who sent in your stories enjoyed having your stories read. If you would like to send in your own stories for me to read, please be sure to check in the description below the video. There will be links to my social media, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Send me your story or a message on any of those, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you do decide to send in a story as well, please be sure to include proper grammar and formatting and try to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with. This will give you the most chance of having your story appear in a video in the future. If you guys are curious about the music used in this video, I usually use music from Deblato Studios or Miuji. I will leave links to their channels in the description below, and you can check them out if you enjoy their stuff. Overall though, guys, I think that's pretty much it for now. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.